Writing variant equals document ID equals 58321. By sunrise, Ethan Cole had been ordered to arrest a woman for a crime that had barely been investigated. The words followed him across the dusty road as he rode toward the eastern edge of Red Creek, where the last cottonwoods gave way to dry grass and open country. The warrant rested inside his coat, folded twice beneath the leather badge he had worn for 3 years. Ethan was 35, broad-shouldered from ranch work, quiet by habit, and careful with every decision that carried another person's fate. Sheriff Amos Vance had given him the order before dawn. Arrest Elena Redbird, Apache woman, suspected of murdering a ranch owner outside town. No questions, no delay. But Ethan had noticed something the sheriff probably wished he had not. The warrant carried yesterday's date. The ranch owner had been found only that morning. Hoofbeats softened as Ethan reached an abandoned water station nearly 6 miles from Red Creek. Wind moved through the broken boards. A tin cup rolled slowly across the porch and stopped against a post. Then he saw her. Elena Redbird sat beside the old trough, calm beneath the pale morning light. She wore a faded brown traveling dress, her dark hair tied back against the wind, and a worn blue blanket rested across her shoulders. She did not reach for a weapon. She did not run. She simply looked at Ethan as if she had been expecting him. He dismounted and kept his hands away from his belt. Elena Redbird? She nodded. Ethan studied her face, then the ground around her. There were tracks leading toward the water station, but none showed a hurried escape. A small leather pouch sat beside her. Her hands were stained with reddish dust. Not blood, clay from the creek bank. Ethan had seen enough ranch country to know the difference. "You know why I'm here?" he asked. Elena looked toward the hills before answering. "I imagine the sheriff told you." Her voice was steady, her English careful. Ethan unfolded the warrant. "You're accused of killing Thomas Bell." She looked at the paper, then back at him. "Did he tell you where I was when it happened?" Ethan paused. "No." "Did he tell you who saw me?" Another pause. "No." The wind moved through the cottonwoods. Somewhere far beyond the ridge, a horse called once and fell silent. Ethan looked down at the warrant again. The sheriff's signature was unmistakable. So was the date. Yesterday. His thumb rested against the paper as a thought settled quietly in his mind. Elin, : Writing variant equals document ID equals 74126. Elena did not answer immediately. She looked past Ethan toward the hills, where the morning sun was beginning to turn the dry grass gold. For several seconds, there was only the sound of wind moving through the cottonwoods. Then she reached for the small leather pouch beside her and placed it on the wooden trough. "Because someone wanted me blamed before anyone knew what happened." Ethan watched her carefully. "Who?" "I do not know." She opened the pouch and removed a folded piece of cloth, a brass button, and a small wooden token marked with a faded star. She set each item down between them. "I found these near the creek this morning." Ethan stepped closer. The brass button caught his attention first. It carried the same insignia used by the county land office. He had seen dozens of them in Red Creek. But this one was scratched along the edge, as though it had been carried for years. "Where exactly did you find these?" "About half a mile from Thomas Bell's ranch." Ethan looked toward the eastern ridge. "You were there?" "I was passing through." "Why?" Elena hesitated. Her expression changed, not with fear, but with the quiet caution of someone deciding whether a stranger had earned the truth. "A family living near the creek needed medicine. I was bringing it to them." Ethan glanced at the wooden token. "And Thomas Bell?" "He was already there when I arrived." "Alive?" Elena nodded. "He was standing beside his fence. He seemed worried. He told me to leave before someone saw me." Ethan frowned. Why would he say that? Because he knew people were looking for him. The answer settled heavily between them. Ethan looked again at the warrant inside his coat. The sheriff had described Bell as an innocent rancher attacked without warning. But Elena was telling him something different. Bell had been afraid before. Anything happened. Ethan walked toward the edge of the station and studied the trail leading back toward town. 2 sets of horse tracks came from the south. One set was fresh. The other was older. Neither belonged to Elena. "You said someone wanted you blamed." "Yes." "How do you know?" Elena picked up the brass button. "Because I was told to leave the creek before sunrise." Ethan turned toward her. "By whom?" She looked at him for a long moment. "A man wearing a silver star." Ethan felt his attention sharpen. There were only a handful of men in Red Creek who wore stars. The sheriff, his deputies, and the county marshal. Did you see his face? No. He stayed in the shadows. Ethan looked down at the ground again. A thin line of dust crossed the station floor. Beside it was a fresh boot print, deep at the heel. He crouched and examined it without touching it. The heel had a narrow metal edge, the kind used by men who rode long hours and spent little time walking. He knew that pattern. Sheriff Amos Vance wore boots with the same iron heel plates. Ethan stood slowly. Elena watched him. You believe me now? She asked. Ethan looked toward Red Creek, 6 miles away, where the courthouse bell would soon call the town to another day of ordinary business. I believe something is wrong. He folded the warrant once more. This time, he did not put it away. He held it in his colon. By the time Ethan and Elena reached the outskirts of Red Creek, the sun stood high enough to burn the morning chill away. Dust hung over the road in a pale veil, and the courthouse bell rang once in the distance. Ethan rode ahead, his warrant still folded in his hand. Elena followed several yards behind, keeping her eyes on the town. Neither spoke for a while. Then Ethan slowed his horse. There are people watching. Elena glanced toward the storefronts. Curtains moved behind dusty windows. A few men stood near the hitching rail outside the general store, pretending not to notice them. Ethan had lived around small towns long enough to understand that kind of silence. News traveled faster than horses. By the time they reached the courthouse square, everyone already knew the Apache woman had returned with the lawman who was supposed to arrest her. Sheriff Amos Vance stood on the courthouse steps. He was tall, gray at the temples, and dressed neatly despite the dust. 2 deputies waited behind him. His eyes settled on Ethan first, then moved to Elena. Cole, he said, I expected you to bring her in. Ethan dismounted. I did. Vance looked at Elena. Then hand her over. Ethan did not move. I have questions. The sheriff gave a small smile. Questions can wait. Not these. A few townspeople gathered near the courthouse doors. Ethan unfolded the warrant. This was signed yesterday. Vance nodded. Correct. Thomas Bell was found this morning. Correct. Ethan held the paper between them. Then why was Elena Redbird named before anyone could have known she was involved? The square became very still. Vance's expression did not change, but his right hand tightened around the brim of his hat. You are assuming the date is important. It is. The clerk may have prepared the warrant early. For a murder that had not happened? Vance looked toward the crowd. You are making a simple matter complicated. Elena remained silent. Ethan noticed one of the deputies watching her with uncertainty rather than anger. The deputy was young, perhaps 25, and his name was Caleb Morris. Ethan had worked beside him once. Caleb looked down when Ethan caught his eye. That small movement said more than words. Someone knew something. Ethan turned back to the sheriff. Where is the county judge? Vance answered too quickly. Out of town. Since when? Yesterday afternoon. Ethan glanced at the courthouse doors. Who witnessed the signing? Vance's smile disappeared. You are forgetting your place. Ethan looked at the badge pinned to his own chest. Maybe. He reached into his coat and removed the brass button Elena had found. He held it up. This came from the creek. Vance stared at it. Just for a second. Then his eyes moved away. Ethan saw it. Elena saw it too. The sheriff cleared his throat. A button proves nothing. No, Ethan said quietly. But recognition does. A murmur moved through the crowd. Vance stepped down from the courthouse porch. You have until sundown to bring her to the jail. Ethan folded the warrant again. And if I do not? The sheriff looked directly at him. Then you will answer for disobeying an order. Ethan said nothing. He turned toward Elena. She had noticed something on the courthouse wall, a faded notice partly covered by another sheet of paper. She walked closer and carefully lifted the corner. Beneath it was an older document. Thomas Bell's name was printed across the top. Elena looked at Ethan. He was selling his land. Ethan stepped beside her. The document showed a date from 3 weeks earlier. At the bottom was a name that made Ethan's expression change. Amos Vance. The sheriff had been negotiating for Bell's property before Bell ever died. And suddenly, the arrest warrant was no longer just a question of who had done something wrong. It was a question of who stood to gain when Thomas Bell was gone. The land document remained in Ethan's hand as the courthouse square slowly emptied. The afternoon heat had settled over Red Creek. pressing the smell of dust and horse leather into the still air. Elena stood beside him, studying the faded ink at the bottom of the page. Amos Vance remained on the courthouse steps, watching them without speaking. Ethan folded the document carefully. We need to know what Thomas Bell planned to do with this land. Elena nodded. He wanted to leave. Why? He told me someone was trying to take it from him. Ethan looked toward the sheriff. Did he tell you who? Elena hesitated. He said he trusted no one in town. Ethan glanced at the courthouse clock. Nearly 2 o'clock. They had until sundown, according to the sheriff. That gave them 4 hours. 4 hours to find a truth that someone had already tried to bury. Ethan led Elena across the square toward the general store. The bell above the door gave a soft ring as they entered. Inside, the room smelled of coffee, flour, saddle soap, and dry cedar. Behind the counter stood Walter Pike, an older merchant who had known Thomas Bell for 20 years. Walter looked at Ethan, then at Elena, and quietly set down the ledger he had been reading. I wondered when someone would come asking about Thomas. Ethan stopped. What do you know? Walter glanced toward the window. He came here 3 days ago, bought coffee, lamp oil, and a new lock for his office. Why a new lock? Walter lowered his voice. He said someone had been going through his papers. Ethan exchanged a glance with Elena. Did he say who? No, but he looked worried. Walter reached beneath the counter and brought out a small envelope. He left this with me yesterday morning. Ethan stared at it. Why? He told me to give it to the first person who asked the right question. Ethan took the envelope. His name was not written on it. Neither was Elena's. There was only one sentence in Thomas Bell's handwriting. Find the ledger before they do. Ethan opened it carefully. Inside was a rough sketch of Red Creek, with 3 locations marked in pencil. The courthouse, Bell's ranch, and an old feed warehouse near the river. Elena studied the map. The warehouse has been empty for years. Then that is where we start, Ethan said. Before they could leave, the bell above the door rang again. Caleb Morris, the young deputy, stepped inside. His face was pale, and he kept one hand on his hat. Ethan, you need to listen. Ethan turned. I am listening. Caleb looked toward the windows. Sheriff Vance knows about the map. The room went quiet. How? Ethan asked. Caleb swallowed. Because I heard him talking to Silas Mercer this morning. They were looking for the same ledger. Elena's eyes narrowed. Who is Silas Mercer? Caleb answered quietly. The county land agent. Ethan remembered the name from the document. The man who had signed the property transfer papers. The same man whose office stood next to the courthouse. Caleb stepped closer. There is something else. Thomas Bell came to me the night before he disappeared. Ethan's expression hardened. What did he say? Caleb looked at Elena, then back at Ethan. He said if anything happened to him, the woman everyone blamed would be the only person who knew where the real evidence was. Elena slowly looked down at the leather pouch beside her. The small wooden token suddenly seemed heavier than it had before. Ethan noticed her expression. What is it? Elena reached into the pouch and removed the token. She turned it over. A tiny number had been carved into the back. 3, 7, 1. Ethan looked toward the river. The old warehouse was marked with the same number on Thomas Bell's map. For the first time, Elena spoke with certainty. He did not leave the evidence with Walter. Ethan nodded. No, he looked toward the fading afternoon light. He left it somewhere only you would think to look. : Writing variant equals document ID equals 41683. The old feed warehouse stood near the river, half hidden behind cottonwood trees and years of dust. Ethan, Elena, and Caleb reached it just before 4 o'clock. The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the empty yard, while the river moved quietly beyond the reeds. Ethan dismounted first and studied the faded number painted above the warehouse door. 3, 7, 1. The same numbers carved into Elena's wooden token. Caleb looked toward the road. We should not stay long. Ethan pushed the door open. Inside, the air smelled of dry timber, old grain, and river mud. Wooden crates stood against the walls, most of them covered with canvas. Elena walked slowly toward the far corner. She stopped beside a narrow shelf and lifted an old tin lantern. Nothing. Then she noticed 3 small marks carved into the wood beneath it. 1, 2, 3. She moved the lantern aside and found a loose board. Ethan knelt and lifted it carefully. Beneath the floor was a shallow wooden box. No lock, no seal, just a strip of faded blue cloth tied around it. Elena reached toward the box, then stopped. Thomas gave me this cloth once, she said. He said it belonged to someone he trusted. Ethan looked at the cloth. Who? Elena shook her head. He never told me. She untied it and opened the box. Inside lay a thick ledger, several folded land documents, and a silver badge wrapped in oilcloth. Ethan stared at the badge. It was older than his own, scratched by years of use, but the shape was unmistakable. His father's badge. For a moment, the warehouse seemed completely silent. Ethan picked it up with both hands. On the back were the initials JC, the same initials carved into the old saddle hanging in. His family barn. Your father? Elena asked. Ethan nodded. Jacob Cole. Caleb looked between them. I thought he died before you came to Red Creek. He did. Ethan turned the badge over. A small strip of paper had been tucked beneath it. He unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable. Jacob Cole had written only 6 words. Ask who owns the land beneath you. Ethan read the sentence twice. Then he opened the ledger. Page after page contained names, dates, property lines, and payments. Thomas Bell's name appeared repeatedly. So did Amos Vance and Silas Mercer. But there was something else. Several properties had been transferred to the same company, one that did not appear on any public county record. Ethan followed the entries with his finger. They were buying land from people who thought they were signing temporary agreements. Caleb leaned closer. Then the agreements were changed. Elena looked at the final page. And Thomas found out. Ethan nodded. At the bottom of the ledger was a fresh entry dated 2 days earlier. Thomas Bell had written a single sentence beside it. They will blame the Apache woman because nobody in town will question the story. Elena stared at the words. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes hardened. He knew. Ethan closed the ledger. He knew they would use you. A sound came from outside. Not loud. Just the slow creak of a wagon wheel somewhere beyond the trees. Caleb moved toward the window. Someone. The wagon had not reached the warehouse yet, but Ethan could already hear the slow rhythm of its wheels through the trees. He motioned for Elena and Caleb to stay inside while he moved toward the doorway. The light outside had begun to soften, turning the river copper beneath the late afternoon sun. A few seconds passed. Then the wagon stopped. No one stepped down. Ethan waited. Caleb whispered, "Could be Vance." Ethan shook his head. Not yet. He looked at the ledger beneath his coat. They had found evidence, but evidence was only useful if it reached someone who could act on it. The wagon started moving again and disappeared along the river road. Ethan waited until the sound faded. We leave now. They rode. Back toward Red Creek by a narrow trail through the cottonwoods. Elena stayed beside Ethan, while Caleb followed behind. After several minutes, she spoke. Your father believed the sheriff was involved. Ethan kept his eyes on the road. My father believed everyone deserved one honest question. And did people listen to him? Ethan was quiet for a moment. Not enough. The words carried more weight than he intended. Near the edge of town, they stopped at a small farmhouse belonging to Samuel Pike's family. Ethan remembered Caleb's warning about the witness. If Samuel had seen what happened to Thomas Bell, the boy might know more than anyone realized. Caleb knocked softly. An older woman opened the door. Her face changed when she saw Ethan. Where is Samuel? Ethan asked. She glanced toward the road. He left this morning. Where did he go? I do not know. Caleb stepped forward. Mrs. Pike, he is in danger if he stays alone. She lowered her voice. He said he was going to the old schoolhouse. Ethan looked at the distant hill. The schoolhouse stood nearly 2 miles outside town, abandoned since the spring floods. They rode there immediately. Inside, dust covered the wooden desks, and sunlight entered through gaps in the shutters. Samuel was sitting near the teacher's desk, holding a folded piece of paper. When he saw Ethan, he stood. Mr. Cole, you came. Ethan crouched slightly, so they were at the same level. You saw something at Thomas Bell's ranch. Samuel nodded. I saw Mr. Mercer there. Caleb looked toward Ethan. Silas Mercer? Samuel nodded again. He was talking with Sheriff Vance. Ethan felt the pieces beginning to fit. What were they talking about? Samuel unfolded the paper. The land. He handed it to Ethan. It was a copy of a property agreement. Thomas Bell's name was written at the top. Beneath it was a transfer clause that would move the property to Mercer's company if Bell failed to repay a debt by sundown. Ethan read the date. It was tomorrow. Then why was Bell already being blamed today? Samuel looked down. because they needed him gone before the agreement became public. Elena stepped closer. Samuel, did Thomas know? Yes. The boy pointed to a note at the bottom. Thomas had written one sentence in the margin. If they cannot take my land legally, they will make the town believe someone else took my life. Ethan folded the paper. Outside, the courthouse bell began to ring. Once, twice, 3 times. Caleb looked toward town. It is almost 5. Ethan checked the sun. Less than an hour remained before sunset. Then Samuel spoke again. There is one more thing. Ethan turned. What? Samuel's voice dropped. Mr. Bell told me your father tried to stop them years ago. Ethan froze. What did he say about my father? Samuel reached into his coat and produced a small envelope. He said Jacob Cole left something behind, and only his son would know where to find it. By late evening, the heat had left the ground. Cottonwood leaves stirred above the Whitmore Creek, silver on one side and green on the other, while the last light settled across the water like a thin sheet of copper. Ayanna sat on the flat rock with the repaired medicine bag resting in her lap. Blue thread from Clara, red from Amos, yellow from Mrs. Talbot, white linen from the church. The stitches were uneven, but none of them had been made for show. Caleb approached carrying his blanket and coffee pot, his boots still dusty from the bar M. He stopped several feet away. You found the place. Ayanna looked toward the small cabin. You leave many things beside the creek. Only the important ones. Her eyes lowered to the medicine bag. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she said, Mercy Creek will tell this story differently tomorrow. Caleb sat on the bank, leaving the same respectful distance between them. It already has. She touched the blue thread with one finger. Some will say they always stood with me. They did not. Some will say Silas acted alone. Caleb looked toward the distant town, where a few lamps were beginning to glow. He did not. The words were quiet. That made them heavier. Ayanna studied him. Will you remind them? Caleb shook his head. Not with words. He pointed toward the creek. Keep it open. The water moved around a pale stone and continued west. Ayanna watched it for several seconds. You still believe kindness is enough? Caleb looked at the medicine bag. It saved Silas's mare. It saved Clara's boy. It kept people standing through winter. He nodded toward the colored stitches. Looks to me like it held the town together. Ayanna lowered her eyes. For months, Mercy Creek had measured her by what she did not possess. No land, no money, no horse, no family powerful enough to speak her name in a courthouse. But the little bag in her lap carried proof that she had given more than most people who owned all of those things. She looked at Caleb. And what do you offer? He opened his palm. The old iron key rested there, darkened by years of use. A place beside me, he said. Never beneath me. Ayanna stared at the key. She did not reach for it immediately. The creek whispered over the stones. Somewhere beyond the cottonwoods, a horse called once and fell silent. Then her fingers touched the metal. Caleb did not move. She closed his hand around it instead. Keep it. He looked at her, almost smiling. You refused it. I remember. She rose and lifted her travel bundle. The cabin stood 20 yards away, small beneath the darkening sky. Ayanna walked toward it, then stopped at the door and looked back. A man should open his own door. Caleb stood. He crossed the grass and stopped beside her, not in front and not behind. Beside, he placed the key into the lock. The door opened with a tired complaint from the hinges. Cold cedar, old ashes, and dust drifted into the evening air. There was only one chair inside. Ayanna looked at it. Caleb followed her eyes. I can build another. You should. Tomorrow. Before the roof? Caleb glanced upward. The roof has waited years. For the first time that evening, Ayanna smiled. Outside, the creek kept moving through the dark. The town still had its old habits. Silas still had his bank. Some doors would remain closed. But one door had opened without asking what blood belonged behind it. And sometimes, on the frontier, that was how a new life began. Morning came softly over the Whitmore place. A pale ribbon of sunlight slipped through the crooked window, touching the second tin cup on the table and the medicine bag. Beside it, Ayanna was already awake. She stood outside with her sleeves rolled to her elbows, watching the creek move through the grass. Caleb stepped onto the porch carrying 2 boards and a hammer. You said tomorrow. It is tomorrow. You work fast. Only when the roof is leaking. She looked toward the cabin. It has been leaking for years. Then it has had years to practice. Ayanna smiled. The sound was small, but the morning seemed to hold it. They spent the next several hours repairing what Caleb had once accepted as permanent. One board became two. Two became 10. By noon, the worst gap in the roof was closed, the second chair was finished, and the old stove had been cleaned enough to smoke only once. There was no grand ceremony. No one from Mercy Creek came riding up the road to announce that the world had changed. Change rarely arrives that way. It came in smaller forms. Martha sent bread wrapped in a clean cloth. Amos left a sack of nails beside the porch. Mrs. Talbot brought yellow thread for the medicine bag. Clara sent Samuel with a small wooden cup he had carved himself. Even Jonah rode out from the bar near sunset and stood beside the fence with his hat in his hands. Silas sold the bay mare, he said. Caleb looked toward him. To whom? A farmer north of town. Ayanna lowered her eyes. She had cared for that animal when no one else would. Jonah smiled faintly. She walked onto the wagon by herself. Caleb nodded. Good judgment finally arrived. Jonah laughed. Then he looked toward the cabin. Silas is leaving Mercy Creek for a while. Where? Dallas, maybe farther. The bank is still open, but people stopped bringing him their money. Caleb said nothing. Jonah glanced at Ayanna. Some folks are asking if the creek can stay open permanently. Ayanna looked toward the water. It was never mine to close. Jonah nodded. That is what I told them. After he left, evening settled across the land. Caleb sat on the porch with his worn photograph of Ruth resting beside him. Ayanna brought 2 cups of coffee and placed one near his hand. You still miss her? Every year. She sat in the second chair. Does it become easier? Caleb looked toward the creek. No. You just learn where to put the missing. Ayanna was quiet for a long time. Then she placed the repaired medicine bag on the table between them. The colored stitches caught the last sunlight. Blue, red, yellow, white. A dozen small reminders that mercy had traveled farther than prejudice. My mother used to say a river remembers every hand that touches it, Ayanna said. Your mother was right. She also said people forget. Caleb looked at her. People do. Then perhaps we should give them something worth remembering. The next morning, Caleb carried a new wooden sign to the creek. It was plain. No painted warning. No family crest. Only 4 words carved into the board. Water for those in need. Ayanna stood beside him as he set it into the earth. She did not smile. She simply rested one hand on the post. The creek moved behind them, clear beneath the morning sun. In time, Mercy Creek would tell the story in many ways. Some would remember the banker who tried to close a road he never owned. Others would remember the old document hidden beneath an apron, or the child saved inside the church, or the woman who gave medicine without asking who deserved it. But Caleb remembered something simpler. Ayanna had once been offered a place beneath someone else's rules. She chose a place beside him instead. And when the first traveler stopped at the creek that afternoon, Caleb stepped back and let Ayanna fill the cup. She handed it to the stranger without asking his name. The water was cold. The road was long. The future was uncertain. But the door was open. The creek was free. And 2 people who had once been told they did not belong were quietly building a home where belonging had never needed permission. 3 months later, the first hard frost came to Mercy Creek. It silvered the fence rails before sunrise and turned the grass beside the water white. Caleb woke before the horses and stepped onto the porch with his coat pulled tight against the cold. The cabin was quiet behind him. A second chair stood beside the stove now. A new shelf held jars of dried medicine. Above the table hung the old iron key. Beneath it, Ayanna had placed the medicine bag with its uneven colored stitches. Caleb looked toward the creek. The wooden sign was still there. Water for those in need. The letters had faded slightly, but nobody had removed it. In fact, someone had added a smaller line beneath them. Mercy Creek belongs to everyone. Caleb smiled. He knew who had carved it. By breakfast, hoofbeats sounded along the eastern road. Martha Bell arrived in a wool coat, carrying a bundle of papers beneath her arm. Amos came behind her in a wagon. Jonah followed with 2 sacks of flour. What is all this? Caleb asked. Martha climbed down slowly. The county finally answered. She handed him the papers. Caleb read the first page, then the second. The Whitmore easement had been formally recorded. The creek could not be closed. The road could not be blocked. The cabin attached to its care could not be taken for debt connected to the water. The words were dry and official. But to Caleb, they sounded like a door unlocking. Silas signed, he asked. Martha nodded. Yesterday. Ayanna stepped onto the porch. She had heard enough. Why? Martha looked at her. Because he finally understood that owning a bank does not mean owning every life that depends on it. Amos cleared his throat. He also sold the building in town. Caleb looked surprised. To whom? Clara. Ayanna smiled. The schoolteacher? She will be soon. Martha laughed softly. Silas gave her the building for $1. Caleb looked toward the road. That sounds like Silas. No, Martha said. That sounds like a man trying to make one honest decision before his pride catches up with him. Later that afternoon, Clara rode out alone. She carried a small wooden box and stopped beside the creek. Inside were schoolbooks, chalk, and a brass bell. She set the bell on the fence post. For the children, she said. All of them. Ayanna touched the bell gently. Then they will know where to come. As winter deepened, the creek became a place people remembered differently. Travelers stopped for water. Farmers rested their horses beneath the cottonwoods. Children from town learned beside children from families who had once been kept apart. Nobody announced a new beginning. Nobody needed to. It happened one cup at a time, one chair at a time, one quiet choice after another. On the first warm morning of spring, Caleb and Ayanna stood beside the water before sunrise. The creek carried melted snow toward the valley, clear and cold beneath the pale sky. Caleb looked at her. Do you miss the road? She watched the current for a long moment. Sometimes. Do you miss being alone? No, he nodded. That was enough. Ayanna reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of blue thread. She tied it around the wooden sign where the winter wind had loosened one corner. Then she stepped back. Caleb stood beside her. No speeches. No promises carved into stone. Only the sound of water moving freely through land that had once been divided by fear. And when the sun finally rose over Mercy Creek, it touched every roof, every field, every face along the road with the same warm light. The frontier had not become gentle overnight. People still carried old prejudices. Some doors remained closed. But one small place had learned something worth carrying forward. A person could be poor and still possess dignity. A stranger could become family without surrendering who they were. And justice, when it finally came to Mercy Creek, did not arrive with a gun or a shout. It arrived quietly, written in old records, carried in a cup of water, and proven by people who chose to leave the door open.